Usually when we think about building something complex, like, say, a suspension bridge, there is this deep, sort of comforting expectation of precision.
Oh, absolutely. It's all physics and engineering.
Right. You calculate the tensile strength of the steel, you measure the load-bearing capacity of the concrete, you follow the blueprints, and, well, the bridge stays up.
Yeah, because the physical world obeys physical laws.
Exactly. It's a purely rational process governed by immutable laws.
You establish the constraints, you apply the mathematical formulas, and the structure stands. There's really no ambiguity there. The numbers dictate the reality, and as long as you respect the math, structural integrity is just guaranteed.
But then you step into the realm of personal finance, and suddenly you realize you aren't building a bridge out of steel and concrete anymore.
Not at all.
You are trying to build a bridge out of human psychology, fragile egos, repressed childhood memories, and honestly, sheer impulse control.
Which is a terrible building material, by the way.
It really is. That pristine mathematical blueprint basically spontaneously combusts. So you, the listener, are joining us today for a deep dive into a paradox that defies conventional logic. We're asking, why do highly educated, accomplished, and otherwise fiercely rational adults consistently make completely destructive choices with their money?
It really is the defining paradox of modern adulthood.
Yeah. And
our mission today, looking at this massive stack of research and behavioral economic analysis we have, is to completely dismantle a very pervasive, toxic myth.
The knowledge myth.
Exactly. In our culture, we tend to treat financial literacy as a simple knowledge problem. I mean, the prevailing assumption has always been that if we just expose people to the right formulas, if we optimize their spreadsheets or mandate financial literacy courses in high school, they will naturally start optimizing their behavior.
But they don't.
They absolutely don't. The sources we're examining today prove that this is a fundamental misdiagnosis of the human condition. So we are going to uncover the hidden cognitive mechanisms and the invisible psychological narratives that are actually steering our financial lives.
Because, if it were just a math problem, accountants would be the only billionaires.
Right. And we know that definitely isn't the case.
The reality is infinitely messier. And it's messier because the environment we're operating in is actively hostile to our biological wiring. We are currently living through a period of unprecedented financial complexity.
The macro environment is brutal right now.
It is. Think about the landscape we are trying to navigate on a daily basis. We've got relentless inflationary pressures, wildly volatile equities, a multi-generational student loan crisis, and a housing affordability catastrophe that has, frankly, completely rewritten the parameters of the American dream.
Yeah, navigating that kind of terrain requires far more than just a balanced ledger. It requires immense psychological resilience. You need the executive function to remain emotionally regulated and make clear-headed, long-term decisions, even when external conditions are profoundly stressful.
And unpredictable.
Right, unpredictable and literally designed to trigger our deepest survival instincts.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even begin to talk about how to fix our behavioral glitches, we have to understand the underlying neurological machinery.
We have to look under the hood.
We do. We have to understand why knowing the optimal financial strategy almost never naturally translates into actually executing it. And the research points to a massive fundamental disconnect in human brain architecture.
We're essentially running on two completely distinct cognitive tracks that are constantly fighting for the steering wheel.
And usually the wrong one is winning.
Pretty much. So intelligence and financial behavior operate on these two fundamentally different neurological systems. On one track, you have analytical intelligence, which is primarily governed by the prefrontal cortex.
The logic center.
Yes. This is the region responsible for logic, deliberate reasoning, abstract thinking, and complex pattern recognition. It's the track you engage to, say, troubleshoot a software architecture problem, or analyze a quarterly earnings report, or map out a 30-year mortgage amortization schedule.
The bridge building track.
Precisely. But then you have the second track. And this one is rooted much deeper in the brain, heavily involving the limbic system.
The lizard brain, as they call it.
Yeah, exactly. This track handles real-time financial decision-making. And unlike the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system does not run on logic or long-term forecasting. It runs on emotion, identity preservation, social comparison, and these deeply embedded ancient survival instincts.
And the conflict arises because these two systems don't just occasionally disagree, they are frequently in catastrophic contradiction.
It's a tug of war.
It really is. Let's look at a scenario that plays out millions of times a day. You can sit at your desk and know intellectually, that carrying a revolving balance on a 24% APR credit card is wealth destruction.
It's financial quicksand.
Right. Your analytical brain fully grasps the mechanics of compound interest working against you. You can model the exact trajectory of how paying only the minimums will double the cost of whatever you bought. And yet, 3 hours later, you will swipe that exact same card for a discretionary luxury item you absolutely do not need.
The mechanism behind that contradiction is purely chemical. In that specific moment of purchase, the emotional payoff of the item completely eclipses the rational calculation.
The dopamine just floods in.
It does. The dopamine hit of acquiring something new, or maybe temporarily soothing the exhaustion of a brutal workday, or signaling status to your peers, that immediate neurochemical reward floods the brain. It quite literally overshadows the abstract mathematical consequences that won't materialize until the statement arrives 30 days later.
So the math doesn't even stand a chance.
No, the prefrontal cortex gets completely drowned out by the limbic system's demand for immediate gratification.
It's the ultimate biological override. The analogy that jumps to mind, reading through the sources, is metabolic health. It is identical to knowing the precise nutritional deficit of eating a massive sugar-loaded pastry.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. You understand the glycemic index, you know exactly what it will do to your insulin response, and your analytical brain fully grasps the long-term cellular damage. But you eat it anyway.
Because in that moment, you're stressed.
Exactly. The visceral sensation of stress or a cortisol spike completely overrides your textbook knowledge of endocrinology. The immediate neurochemical comfort of the sugar simply obliterates the abstract concept of your long-term cardiovascular health.
The parallel is perfect because both scenarios deal with our evolutionary programming conflicting with modern abundance. What's fascinating about the source material here is that for a very long time, the entire academic field of economics just refused to acknowledge this biological reality.
They just pretended humans were robots.
They really did. Classical economics was constructed on the foundational assumption of Homo economicus. That's the theoretical concept that humans are purely rational, utility-maximizing actors.
Which sounds hilarious in hindsight.
It does. The dominant theory literally dictated that if you provided a person with perfect information, they would flawlessly calculate the probabilities and execute the decision that optimized their financial well-being.
Which, looking back at the history of market bubbles and just the sheer volume of consumer debt, is a staggering level of academic delusion.
It was a massive collective blind spot. It took the advent of behavioral economics to correct the record. You had pioneers like Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, and Richard Thaler who set their entire careers proving that human financial behavior is riddled with profound irrationality.
Right.
But the crucial insight from their work, and this is vital for you listening to Internalize, is that our irrationality is not random, nor is it a unique personal failing.
It's not a character flaw.
Exactly. It is a predictable, systematic feature of human cognition. We all share the exact same flawed evolutionary hardware.
Which shifts the narrative entirely. I mean, we aren't making destructive choices because we lack intelligence. We're making them because we are biologically optimized for an environment that no longer exists.
Well said.
But that means we need to meticulously audit how this hardware is misfiring. Having established that our brains are predictably irrational, let's transition into the specific cognitive biases, the glitches in our software that systematically distort our financial reality.
There are 4 primary mechanisms outlined in the research.
Let's start with present bias, because that seems to be the main driver of our collective inability to save money.
Yeah, present bias is the human tendency to disproportionately weight immediate rewards over vastly superior future benefits. It's a phenomenon known in behavioral economics as hyperbolic discounting.
Hyperbolic discounting.
Right. We have a neurological inability to value tomorrow as highly as we value today. And the further out the reward is, the more steeply our brain discounts its value.
I want to push back on this slightly, though, or at least play devil's advocate. From an evolutionary standpoint, isn't present bias highly logical?
How so?
Well, if you are a hunter-gatherer, a piece of fruit today is infinitely more valuable than the promise of a piece of fruit next month, because next month you might be dead.
Oh, absolutely. That is the exact evolutionary origin of the bias. In an ancestral environment characterized by severe scarcity and high mortality, deferring gratification was a terrible survival strategy.
You just starve waiting for compound interest.
Exactly. You consumed calories immediately because the future was entirely theoretical. The problem is that we transplanted a brain optimized for the Pleistocene epoch into a modern financial system that demands 30-year planning horizons.
So how does that cognitive mismatch actually play out with our money day to day?
Consider the choice between buying a heavily marketed $200 pair of sneakers today versus putting that same $200 into a diversified index fund.
Yeah.
The sneakers are a concrete, immediate reward. Your sensory cortex can process them. You can feel the material. You anticipate the social validation. You get the immediate dopamine spike.
Right, or tangible.
Exactly. Conversely, the index fund is entirely abstract. The idea that compounding returns might turn that $200 into $1,500 over 3 decades is a mathematical concept processed in the prefrontal cortex, but it offers zero immediate sensory or emotional reward.
It's as if the brain perceives the future you as a completely different entity. I mean, why should I deprive my very real, very stressed current self of these sneakers for the benefit of some hypothetical 65-year-old stranger who lives in the year 2055?
Well, that's exactly it. There is actually functional MRI research supporting that exact sentiment.
Wait, really? fMRI scans?
Yes. When individuals are placed in an fMRI machine and asked to think about their future selves, the neural regions that activate are the exact same regions that light up when they think about a complete stranger. We are literally neurologically wired to view our future selves as other people. And this single bias is the primary psychological engine behind massive macroeconomic trends. Think about the $1.1 trillion in collective credit card debt held by Americans.
It's staggering.
That mountain of debt isn't a result of widespread innumeracy. It's a result of hardware that prioritizes present consumption over future solvency.
And the friction of that bias has to be exponential for someone operating in actual financial scarcity. If your baseline is already stressed, the future must seem completely irrelevant.
The research on scarcity and cognitive bandwidth is so illuminating here. When an individual is living paycheck to paycheck, genuinely terrified about covering rent or keeping the utilities on, their cognitive bandwidth narrows dramatically.
It's a tunneling effect.
Yes, a tunneling effect. All executive function is hijacked to solve the immediate crisis of survival. Suggesting that someone in that state should prioritize a Roth IRA or ponder their asset allocation isn't just difficult, it's psychologically impossible.
The future is a luxury commodity they cannot afford to process.
Precisely.
It's like lecturing someone who is actively drowning about the importance of cardiovascular health. I mean, they just need oxygen.
That's exactly it.
Okay, so present bias hijacks our timeline. Let's move to the second cognitive glitch. Loss aversion. This one fascinates me because it fundamentally proves that human beings do not experience emotions symmetrically. The scales are completely rigged.
They are heavily rigged. Loss aversion describes the profound asymmetry in our psychological accounting, where the emotional pain of losing a specific amount of money is roughly twice as intense as the joy of gaining that exact same amount.
So if I find a crisp $100 bill on the sidewalk, I experience a nice little dopamine bump. I'm pleased. But if I check my pocket and realize I dropped a $100 bill, I am viscerally angry. It ruins my entire afternoon.
Oh, without a doubt.
The magnitude of the negative emotion just completely dwarfs the positive one.
That's because the brain's threat detection center, the amygdala, processes financial loss in the exact same way it processes physical danger. Losing resources triggers an acute stress response.
A survival response.
Right, and when you apply this neurological asymmetry to complex systems like the stock market, you immediately understand why retail investors consistently underperform the very funds they invest in. Consider the psychology of a market correction. Historically, the data overwhelmingly dictates that the optimal strategy during a downturn is to remain invested, rebalance, and wait for the recovery.
But when an investor logs into their brokerage account and sees a 30% drawdown over 6 weeks, they aren't looking at historical data. They are looking at a literal threat.
The terror bypasses the prefrontal cortex entirely. The fear of losing the remainder of their capital overrides all rational understanding of market cycles and historical returns. And this dynamic is what drives the phenomenon known as capitulation.
Capitulation is such a severe term in finance. Unpack the actual mechanics of that moment for us.
Capitulation is the psychological breaking point. It is the exact moment where the investor simply starts resisting the fear. The psychological agony of watching the portfolio balance drop day after day becomes so intolerable that they just surrender.
They just sell everything.
They sell their positions and move everything to cash. But not as a strategic asset allocation move. It's done purely to make the emotional pain stop.
But the cruel irony is that by selling to stop the pain, they inflict the fatal wound. They convert a temporary, unrealized paper loss into a permanent realized loss.
Exactly.
And because mass capitulation generally signals the absolute bottom of a market cycle, they subsequently miss the inevitable recovery.
It is the defining tragedy of behavioral finance. Mathematics screams hold, but psychology demands that you flee the burning building. In the gap between mathematical logic and psychological survival instinct is where generational wealth is routinely incinerated. People act out of a desperate desire for safety, and in doing so, they guarantee their own financial destruction.
That is incredibly heavy. It just shows how our instincts, which kept us alive in the jungle, actively slaughter us in the markets. All right, the third bias operates much more quietly, almost like a background hum.
Anchoring is insidious because it operates entirely below our conscious awareness. It is a cognitive heuristic where our judgment about a value, whether it's a retail price, a salary offer, or a home valuation, is disproportionately influenced by the very first number we encounter.
The anchor.
Right. That initial number drops an anchor into our subconscious, and all subsequent analysis is evaluated relative to that anchor, regardless of the objective intrinsic value of the asset itself.
I feel like I see this constantly in retail architecture. The entire concept of the sale relies on this glitch, doesn't it?
Oh, completely.
You walk into a department store and see a winter coat. The tag prominently displays an original price of $400, but it's slashed down to a clearance price of $180.
And your brain just lights up.
Exactly. The brain's reward center immediately fires. You feel this rush of victory because you are calculating a $220 savings. You feel incredibly savvy. But what if similar coats, utilizing the exact same materials and manufacturing processes, routinely sell for $120 at other outlets?
Your brain fails to process the $120 objective value because the retailer successfully implanted that $400 anchor.
Right.
You are no longer evaluating the coat based on the cost of its raw materials, or the quality of its stitching, or the broader market rate. You are evaluating the $180 price point strictly in relation to the artificial $400 anchor.
So the original price isn't a historical fact. It's a highly engineered cognitive manipulation.
Absolutely.
They invent an inflated manufacturer's suggested retail price specifically to serve as an anchor. It allows them to charge you exactly what they intended to charge you all along, while literally tricking your brain into thanking them for the privilege.
And while overpaying for a coat is, a minor leakage of wealth, anchoring dictates the outcomes of the most consequential financial transactions of our entire lives.
Like buying a house.
Consider real estate. The asking price of a home acts as a massive psychological anchor. It completely frames the perception of what prospective buyers believe is a reasonable offer, frequently untethering the negotiation entirely from the fundamental appraised value of the property or comparable sales data.
Or salary negotiation.
Yes, look at salary negotiations. The first number introduced into the conversation anchors the entire trajectory of the negotiation. If an applicant anchors too low, they will spend the remainder of the discussion fighting against this gravitational pull to get back to a baseline market rate, because the employer's perception of their value has been artificially depressed by that initial figure.
It really highlights the cognitive laziness of the brain. We default to relative comparison because calculating absolute value requires too much computational energy.
It's shortcut.
Okay, let's round out the four horsemen with the final bias. Herd behavior and FOMO, the fear of missing out.
Herd behavior is the deeply ingrained evolutionary drive to conform to the actions of the majority, particularly in environments of high ambiguity or uncertainty. Even if your independent, rational analysis suggests the crowd is making an error, the biological pressure to conform is just staggering.
Because in the ancestral environment, straying from the herd generally resulted in predation.
Exactly. Conformity equals safety.
I'm reminded of those famous Asch conformity experiments, where people would knowingly give the wrong answer to a simple visual test just because everyone else in the room gave the wrong answer.
Right, the line length test.
Yeah, the discomfort of standing alone overrides our own eyes. But in modern finance, following the herd doesn't protect you from predators. It usually marches you directly off a cliff.
Herd behavior is the psychological engine driving every major speculative bubble in economic history. I mean, analyze the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, or the more recent frenzies surrounding cryptocurrency and meme stocks.
It's the same pattern every time.
It is. In all these manias, millions of otherwise rational actors committed massive amounts of capital, not because the underlying fundamentals supported the valuations, not because they had done rigorous discounted cash flow models.
No one is doing a cash flow model on a meme stock.
Right. They did it simply because their neighbors, their colleagues, and everyone on their social media feeds were participating.
And FOMO is the accelerant there, because the fear of missing out doesn't just compel you to join the herd, it fundamentally distorts your perception of time and risk.
That is the critical variable. Under normal, rational conditions, an investor might take weeks or months to research an asset, analyze a balance sheet, or review a prospectus. But FOMO injects a manufactured sense of life or death urgency.
A panic.
The internal narrative shifts from analysis to panic. It becomes, if I don't bid on this house today, I will be permanently priced out of the middle class. Or if I don't buy this token right now, I'm going to miss out on generational wealth while my financially illiterate cousin becomes a millionaire.
It's that social comparison again.
It compresses the decision-making timeline. It transforms rational due diligence into desperate, urgent trend chasing.
And what makes this infinitely more toxic today than in previous decades is the environment where we actually observe the herd. The sources delve into this concept of the social theater of wealth.
Oh, this is so important.
We are constantly bombarded by curated algorithms on platforms like Instagram or TikTok, showcasing peers driving luxury vehicles, taking bespoke vacations, and wearing haute couture. Our limbic system processes those images as concrete evidence that everyone else is thriving while we are stagnating, but we are reacting to a curated facade. We don't see the underlying balance sheet.
The asymmetry of information on social media is absolutely devastating to financial health. What appears as effortless, abundant prosperity is, in reality, frequently sustained by heavily leveraged consumption.
Leveraged consumption.
You observe the aesthetic appeal of the new luxury SUV. You do not observe the devastating reality of the 84-month auto loan financed at an 11% interest rate.
Right.
You see the geotag photos from the Maldives. You do not see the rolling credit card balances sustained entirely by minimum payments. We are interpreting debt as wealth.
Leveraged consumption. That phrase is just chilling. We are taking on very real, crushing debt to compete with an illusion of prosperity projected by people who are secretly drowning in their own debt.
It is a collective hallucination.
It really is. So we've mapped out these universal hardware glitches: present bias, loss aversion, anchoring, and herd behavior. These affect everyone. But the sources suggest that to truly understand our financial chaos, we have to look deeper than the universal biases.
We have to look at the software.
Exactly. Biases explain how our brains misfire in the moment, but they don't explain why we individually assign such radically different meanings to money. To understand that, we have to decode our invisible operating systems. We have to analyze money scripts.
Moving from the universal biases to money scripts is really where behavioral finance intersects deeply with clinical psychology. The framework of money scripts was pioneered by financial psychologists Brad and Ted Klontz.
And what did they find?
Their research revealed that beneath the surface of our conscious financial choices are deeply rooted, unconscious beliefs about money that we internalize during early childhood. These beliefs function exactly like an operating system running quietly in the background, silently filtering information and governing our adult behaviors without our conscious consent.
So these aren't lessons we were explicitly taught in a classroom.
No, not at all.
These are the inferences we drew as children while watching our parents navigate the world. It's the lesson a child internalizes when they hear their parents screaming about credit card bills through a bedroom wall. Or it's the silent tension at the dinner table when a high-earning relative visits.
Children are incredibly observant, but terrible interpreters.
Right. We take these highly specific, isolated emotional events and crystallize them into absolute universal laws about how money works, and then we just never question them again.
Exactly. The Klontz research categorizes these unconscious beliefs into 4 primary scripts. The first is money avoidance.
Okay, money avoidance.
The foundational premise of this script is that money is inherently corrupting, and that wealth is inextricably linked to moral decay. Individuals operating on this script subconsciously believe there is an inherent virtue in financial struggle, and that to desire wealth is to be intrinsically greedy or shallow.
I have to imagine that script results in catastrophic self-sabotage in a professional setting.
The symptoms of money avoidance are highly destructive and deeply internalized. These are the professionals who consistently underprice their services or refuse to ask for raises because advocating for their financial worth feels morally repugnant to them.
Wow.
They might impulsively give away money they objectively cannot afford to part with, simply to alleviate the cognitive dissonance and discomfort of accumulating it. They frequently avoid looking at their financial statements entirely. Because they associate financial ambition with a loss of moral purity, they subconsciously construct a life that ensures they never achieve financial stability.
It's as if they have an internal psychological thermostat set strictly to survival mode. And the moment they start to accumulate surplus capital, the thermostat detects a breach of their moral identity and forces them to purge the excess.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
That is fascinating. What is the second script?
The polar opposite, money worship. This script is built on the deeply held, absolute conviction that money is the singular key to happiness, and that an increase in income will unequivocally resolve all of life's emotional and existential problems.
The classic, if I just hit this specific number, I will finally be able to exhale mentality.
But the tragedy of the money worship script is its infinite regress. It demands absolute sacrifice for a payoff that never arrives. Individuals driven by this script will routinely cannibalize their physical health, dissolve their marriages, and alienate their children in the relentless pursuit of income.
Because they think it will fix everything.
Right. And the cruelest mechanism of this script is hedonic adaptation.
The moving goalpost.
Yes, the goalpost is constantly moving. They convince themselves, I will find peace when I hit a low six-figure salary. They achieve it, experience a brief dopamine spike, and then their baseline resets, the peace evaporates.
So they just move the target.
They recalibrate. The problem is, I actually need $250,000. They hit these milestones, but because capital cannot cure an existential void, hitting the numbers provides no lasting satisfaction. They are trapped on a hedonic treadmill, endlessly sprinting toward a finish line that perpetually recedes.
It's the definition of a Sisyphean task. Trying to cure internal anxiety with external capital is like trying to quench your thirst by chugging salt water. It only amplifies the dehydration.
That's a great analogy.
Okay, the third script identified in the research is money status. How does this distinctly differ from money worship?
Where money worship is fundamentally about the pursuit of happiness, money status is fundamentally about identity and hierarchy. It is the core belief that your net worth is completely identical to your self-worth.
Oh, wow.
In this operating system, the two concepts are inextricably fused. You cannot separate your intrinsic value as a human being from the visible assets you control.
I see exactly where this is going. If your net worth and your self-worth are fused, then any volatility in your bank account is a direct attack on your soul.
Precisely. If you are governed by the money status script, you evaluate your own legitimacy based on the brand pedigree of your clothing, the exclusivity of your zip code, and the perceived prestige of your job title.
It's all outward signaling.
Right. The behavioral symptoms are overt. You see extreme overspending on Veblen goods, luxury items, whose demand increases as their price increases purely for status signaling. They carry dangerous levels of high-interest debt solely to maintain the facade, driven by a paralyzing existential terror of appearing ordinary or impoverished.
This clarifies so much about the hidden suffering in upper-middle-class culture. A financial setback isn't a logistical problem. It is a total identity collapse.
It becomes an existential threat. For an individual running the money status script, a corporate layoff or a market downturn isn't just an economic inconvenience. It is a profound invalidation of their existence.
That's terrifying.
This script is the primary accelerant for America's culture of deep financial shame. It explains why individuals will go to astonishing lengths to hide insolvency or impending bankruptcy from their own spouses for years. Admitting financial failure feels exactly equivalent to admitting they are fundamentally worthless as a human being.
It's absolutely heartbreaking. It really illustrates the lethal danger of tying your psychological foundation to a volatile market.
Let's examine the final script. Money vigilance. Now, intuitively, vigilance sounds like a positive trait. We are constantly told to be vigilant with our finances.
And frugality, caution, and risk management are highly adaptive traits. But money vigilance, as a psychological script, crosses the threshold into pathology. It manifests as excessive worry, chronic anxiety, and intense financial secrecy.
So driven by fear.
The core animating belief of this script is that catastrophic disaster is always imminent. And no magnitude of accumulated wealth is ever truly sufficient to insulate you from ruin.
So what are the behavioral markers of someone trapped in a state of money vigilance? What does it look like? It looks like compulsive hoarding of resources to the point of severe self-deprivation. It is an absolute paralyzing inability to transition from the accumulation phase of wealth to the decumulation phase.
They can't spend it.
They cannot spend money comfortably, even on essential medical care or experiences that would bring immense joy, even when their balance sheet proves they can afford it 100 times over. Every single transaction is processed through a lens of impending doom.
The profound irony here is that they often successfully achieve the goal of accumulating massive wealth, but their psychological operating system denies them the ability to actually utilize it.
They build a fortress of capital, but they live inside it like a prisoner.
They are incredibly wealthy on paper, but entirely impoverished in their daily lived experience.
It is a quiet, highly rationalized tragedy. And unpacking these four scripts, avoidance, worship, status, and vigilance, is really the analytical key to understanding why we do what we do. Because once you can identify your own ingrained script and combine that with the universal cognitive biases we discussed earlier, you finally have the complete equation.
The equation for why modern financial culture generates such inescapable chronic stress.
Exactly.
Which provides a perfect bridge to the next major theme from our sources: the epidemic of financial anxiety versus actual danger. When you synthesize our glitchy evolutionary hardware with these deeply flawed psychological software scripts, you produce a society that is practically vibrating with chronic cortisol spikes. It completely blurs the neurological line between feeling unsafe and actually being unsafe.
This is perhaps the most crucial distinction highlighted in the source material. We have to meticulously separate financial anxiety from financial danger.
How do you define the difference?
Danger is objective. Danger is mathematical. Danger is my rent is due in 24 hours, my checking account is overdrawn, and I have exhausted all credit facilities.
Right.
That is a real, literal emergency requiring immediate crisis management.
Right.
But financial anxiety is entirely subjective. You have a chronic physiological state of feeling financially imperiled, even when you are, by all objective metrics, completely stable, solvent, and secure.
I want to dig into the neurological toll of that. How does living in a state of chronic subjective anxiety impact our executive function and our ability to make sound choices? Because I know when my stress levels spike, my decision-making horizon shrinks to about 5 minutes.
Oh, chronic anxiety severely impairs the prefrontal cortex.
Yep.
It keeps you locked in a low-grade fight or flight response. Behaviorally, this drives the extreme resource hoarding we see in money vigilance. It causes extreme risk aversion, where individuals refuse to allocate any capital to equities because they are terrified of short-term volatility.
Which mathematically guarantees they will lose purchasing power to inflation over time.
Exactly. And it drives a culture of severe burnout, where people work themselves into physical collapse, chasing a phantom sense of security that never actually materializes. Because the anxiety is generated internally by their scripts, not externally by their balance sheet.
And we cannot ignore the cultural context here. The American cultural narrative acts as a massive amplifier for this anxiety.
The hyper-individualism.
Yes, we have a society built on the mythology of rugged individualism. From childhood, the narrative dictates that you must be entirely self-reliant. You are expected to independently construct a fortress against every conceivable disaster.
It's an exhausting expectation.
You must independently fund a 6-month emergency reserve, independently master the tax code, independently manage a comprehensive retirement portfolio, and independently secure healthcare. And the implicit message is that if you fall short of perfect comprehensive preparation, you are a moral failure.
The psychological burden of that hyper-individualism is just crushing. It makes any degree of financial uncertainty feel completely untenable. Because if you truly believe you must face every systemic economic crisis entirely alone, without a communal or structural safety net, then a normal, everyday financial fluctuation.
Like a transmission repair.
Right, a routine transmission repair, a temporary dip in the S&P 500, an unexpected medical copay. It doesn't register as a minor logistical bump. It is processed by the brain as a catastrophic, life-threatening failure.
It's placing the weight of global macroeconomic volatility onto one individual's checking account. It's an impossible standard.
It is statistically impossible to achieve perfect security. And the core insight from the behavioral psychologists is that when individuals are gripped by this profound financial anxiety, the panic is rarely about the literal numbers in the spreadsheet.
It's about what the numbers represent.
Yes, the numbers are merely proxies. The panic is about what those numbers represent to their specific money script. Money represents control over one's environment. It represents physical safety. It represents social worth. It represents a shield against the fundamental, terrifying unpredictability of human existence. When that shield feels inadequate, the existential dread is overwhelming.
So we have thoroughly mapped out this treacherous psychological minefield. We know our evolutionary hardware discounts the future, overreacts to losses, anchors to arbitrary data, and blindly follows the herd.
It's a miracle we save any money at all.
Right. We know our childhood money scripts are quietly executing code that sabotages us, and we know our hyper-individualistic culture breeds chronic, paralyzing anxiety. That is a devastating diagnosis.
It is.
If awareness alone is insufficient. I mean, if just understanding the mechanics of hyperbolic discounting doesn't actually stop my limbic system from craving a dopamine hit, how do we survive this? How do we build an architecture that overrides our biology?
Well, this is where we pivot from diagnosis to structural intervention. You are absolutely correct that intellectual awareness is insufficient. You can possess a PhD in behavioral economics, and your limbic system will still demand the instant gratification of an impulse purchase.
So what's the solution?
To fundamentally alter behavior, the sources advocate for a philosophy of systems over willpower. We must abandon the flawed reliance on our fragile, easily depleted emotional willpower to make optimal choices in real time.
Willpower is a finite resource.
Exactly. Instead, we have to construct rigid systems that execute the optimal choices automatically. The research distills this into 5 core, actionable strategies.
Let's get into them. Strategy number 1, automate. This concept is so elegantly simple, but profoundly effective. You have to actively remove the human element, specifically your own glitchy, easily fatigued brain.
Remove it from the equation.
Right, from the most consequential financial behaviors, so your biases are never given a chance to vote.
Automation is the ultimate structural defense against present bias. Consider the mechanics of saving. If you rely on manual transfers logging into your portal every month and moving funds from checking to savings, you are forcing yourself to make a painful, conscious choice every single time.
It hurts to part with the money.
It does. You have to actively summon the willpower to sacrifice present consumption for future security. And eventually you will experience decision fatigue, or you will have an incredibly stressful week and your willpower will just collapse.
But if you automate the process?
If you automate it, the capital is reallocated the exact moment your direct deposit clears, before your conscious brain even registers its presence. The optimal choice is made exactly once, in a moment of rational clarity when you design the system, and your limbic system is never granted the opportunity to veto the transaction.
And the most compelling empirical evidence for this is found in the administration of employer-sponsored retirement accounts, right?
Oh, the data on 401k participation completely validates this. It is one of the most famous findings in behavioral economics. When corporations offer a retirement plan where the employee must actively complete paperwork to opt in, participation rates consistently stagnate around 60 to 70%.
Because it requires effort.
Exactly. The process requires executive function, it requires overcoming inertia, so humans naturally procrastinate. However, when the exact same corporations simply invert the system to automatic enrollment, meaning the employee is enrolled by default and must actively complete paperwork to opt out, participation rates skyrocket past 90%.
Let me make sure I'm emphasizing this correctly for you, the listener. It is the exact same demographic of employees, the exact same mathematical tax benefits, and the exact same amount of paperwork.
Nothing changed but the default setting.
The only variable that changed was the default setting. It conclusively proves that choice architecture dictates behavior far more effectively than financial education.
Without a doubt.
If you want to guarantee success, you must engineer your life so that the optimal choice requires 0 effort and the destructive choice requires massive effort, which leads perfectly into strategy 2, which is essentially the inverse of automation. Create friction. If automation makes good habits invisible, friction makes bad habits exhausting.
Exactly. And the objective of friction isn't to take a vow of asceticism or forbid yourself from ever consuming. The objective is to introduce strategic, incremental barriers into your impulsive spending loops. You are intentionally slowing the process down just enough to allow the prefrontal cortex time to boot up and override the limbic system before capital is deployed.
Give me the mechanics of that. How do we synthesize friction in a digital world designed for seamless consumption?
It begins with dismantling the infrastructure of instant gratification. You go into your preferred e-commerce platforms and deliberately delete your saved credit card profiles.
Oh, that's a big one.
When a retailer has your payment data cached, Purchasing is a one-click action driven entirely by a dopamine impulse. There's zero latency. But if you force yourself to physically stand up, locate your wallet, extract the card, and manually input 16 digits in a security code, you introduce a mechanical delay. That tiny increment of friction creates a window for cognitive reflection.
It breaks the hypnotic trance of consumerism. I love that. What else?
Other highly effective friction protocols include instituting a mandatory 48-hour cooling-off period for any discretionary purchase exceeding a certain threshold, say $50, or aggressively unsubscribing from all promotional retail marketing emails so your brain isn't constantly bombarded with manufactured anchored temptations.
I want to focus on that 48-hour rule, because it exposes the illusion of our desires. What you realize when you enforce a delay is that the vast majority of our purchasing impulses are incredibly fragile.
They really are.
They cannot survive a 48-hour quarantine. The emotional charge, that burning, visceral urgency to acquire the item, it simply evaporates. 2 days later, you review the digital shopping cart, and your prefrontal cortex looks at the items and thinks, under what hallucination did I believe I needed a specialized, Bluetooth-enabled water bottle?
It's hilarious how quickly the desire fades.
The urgency wasn't real, it was just a chemical spike.
The neurochemistry dissipates, and logical analysis regains control. Now, strategy 3 requires much deeper introspective labor. Consciously examine your scripts.
This sounds less like financial planning and much more like cognitive behavioral therapy. We have to actively excavate our money scripts.
It's absolutely a form of targeted self-therapy.
Right.
You cannot dismantle an operating system you refuse to acknowledge. You have to deliberately excavate those unconscious beliefs internalized during your formative years.
How do you do that?
You have to carve out time to ask yourself highly uncomfortable questions. What specific phrases did I repeatedly overhear about money when I was 8 years old? Was debt utilized as a strategic tool? Or was it the source of hushed, panicked conversations? Was wealth discussed with admiration and aspiration? Or with deep-seated resentment and suspicion?
You have to drag the invisible code out of the subconscious and into the light of the rational brain.
You do. Because until you make the unconscious conscious, it will dictate your behavior, and you'll call it fate. Once you lay these scripts out on the table, you can engage neuroplasticity. You can rationally evaluate a money status script and declare, I internalize the belief that the badge on my car dictates my human worth. But that belief is factually incorrect, it is bankrupting my family, and it no longer serves my goals. I actively choose to discard it.
That's powerful.
It requires immense emotional labor, but it is the only path to genuine financial autonomy.
I see how powerful that is. Now, strategy 4 directly addresses the chronic stress we discussed earlier. Separate anxiety from danger. And I'm glad we are expanding on this because it feels like the most difficult strategy to deploy when you're actually in the middle of a panic spiral.
It is difficult,
Yeah.
which is why it requires active, mindful repetition. It borrows heavily from cognitive behavioral techniques. When you feel that visceral knot of panic in your stomach regarding your finances, when the money vigilance script triggers your fight or flight response, you have to train yourself to execute a hard pause. You must force yourself to look at the objective, mathematical data.
You have to audit reality instead of auditing your feelings.
Precisely. You review the balance sheet. You actively remind yourself, I have a 3-month emergency reserve. My primary source of income is stable. My foundational liabilities are covered. The physiological panic I am currently experiencing is a neurochemical misfire.
It's a reaction to uncertainty.
Right. It is a reaction to the abstract concept of uncertainty, not a literal threat to my survival. I am objectively safe. By ruthlessly separating the subjective emotional anxiety from the objective mathematical reality, you deactivate the amygdala and prevent yourself from executing panicked reactionary choices.
Like liquidating your portfolio at the bottom of a market cycle.
Exactly.
That is profound. It's using logic to talk your nervous system off a ledge. And finally, strategy 5. I find this one incredibly liberating because it is arguably the most counterintuitive piece of advice in the entire realm of personal finance. Accept your own irrationality.
It runs counter to everything we are taught. We expend massive amounts of psychological energy flagellating ourselves for our financial missteps, striving for this impossible, pristine standard of Homo economicus. But the most robust, scientifically grounded strategy is simply accepting that your brain is fundamentally, permanently flawed when it comes to modern finance.
The analogy I came across in the reading that just perfectly encapsulates this Expecting our ancient evolutionary brains to naturally excel at navigating global financial markets is literally like expecting a horse to perform well on a crowded, multi-lane interstate highway.
Like a brilliant image.
Like, yes, mechanically the horse possesses legs. It is physically capable of galloping on the asphalt, but its sensory apparatus is completely terrified by the semi-trucks. It cannot comprehend the concept of lane markers, and eventually, inevitably, it is going to get spooked and cause a massive catastrophic pileup. It is a biological organism forced to operate in a highly engineered, deeply unnatural environment that it was never designed for.
That analogy is flawless. Our neural architecture evolved to optimize physical survival in a natural environment. We evolved to calculate the trajectory of predators, to manage caloric scarcity, and to navigate complex tribal hierarchies.
Not index funds.
No, we did not evolve to comprehend 30-year mortgage amortization schedules, or the compounding mathematics of index funds, or the systemic risk profile of collateralized debt obligations. Those concepts are entirely alien to our evolutionary hardware.
So the objective isn't to somehow train the horse to transform into a sports car. The goal isn't achieving perfect robotic rationality. The goal is to build an environment utilizing extreme automation, strategic friction, and psychological awareness where our inevitable mistakes simply cost us less. We construct massive guardrails so that when the horse inevitably gets spooked by a market crash or a shiny luxury good, it just bounces off the rail instead of running off a cliff.
We engineer the environment to compensate for the organism. You forgive yourself for the biological glitch, but you relentlessly build the system to catch it.
This has been an absolutely phenomenal paradigm-shifting exploration. We've traversed from the macroeconomy down to the neurochemistry of our brains, and we've decoded the exact mechanisms behind why we sabotage our own prosperity. As we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought that builds on that concept of hyperbolic discounting and the horse on the highway. We established that our brains are biologically wired, as proven by fMRI scans, to treat our future self like a complete stranger. That is the root cause of why saving capital feels like a loss rather than a gain.
Because it feels like an unreciprocated transfer of wealth to someone you don't even know.
Right. But what if, instead of fighting that neurological reality, we leaned into it? What if we utilize a different psychological framework? What would happen if you started actively cultivating deep, intentional empathy for that stranger?
I love that framing.
Could you reframe the entire concept of financial planning, not as a tedious, restrictive math problem, but as an act of profound, intentional hospitality to an older, much more tired version of yourself? If you start viewing your investment account not as a deprivation of your current joy, but as a care package you are painstakingly assembling and sending forward in time to an older friend, it bridges the gap between your logical intentions and your emotional decisions. You aren't depriving yourself today, you are taking care of someone you love tomorrow.
Viewing financial security as an act of profound hospitality across time, that fundamentally changes the emotional valence of saving from deprivation to generosity.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, we aren't just building a suspension bridge out of steel and math. We are attempting to build a bridge across time, to connect who we are today with who we will be decades from now. And it turns out the strongest, most resilient material you can use for that bridge isn't a complex spreadsheet. It's empathy. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, learner. Take these insights, audit your own invisible scripts, build your guardrails, and see if you can change just one small assumption about what your money really means to you. We'll see you next time. So imagine, if you will, that you're sitting at a Thanksgiving dinner. Or maybe it's just, a casual weekend get-together with a group of friends you've known for years.
Right, it's super relaxed vibe.
Exactly. You're sitting around this cluttered dining table, you're passing the mashed potatoes, somebody is pouring a second glass of wine, and the vibe is just incredibly relaxed.
Yeah.
And out of nowhere, as happens so often these days, people start unpromptedly sharing these hyper-intimate, deeply personal details about their lives. Like your aunt gives you a literal play-by-play of her recent gallbladder surgery.
Oh, complete with the recovery times and all the digestive issues.
Right. And then your cousin, without missing a single beat, launches into the extremely messy, emotionally raw details of their ongoing divorce. I mean, outlining exactly what their soon-to-be ex said in mediation.
Just putting it all out there.
Yeah. And then a close friend casually brings up a major breakthrough they just had in therapy regarding, their childhood trauma and their mother.
And the wild thing is, no one bats an eye.
Not at all.
That level of disclosure is practically the price of admission for a dinner party today. We all just kind of lean in, nod, offer these empathetic murmurs.
Exactly. It is completely normal. We validate them, we listen, we offer support. But then, imagine the conversation lulls for a second, and you lean over to that same cousin who just bared their soul about their broken marriage, and you ask a very simple, purely numerical question.
Uh-oh.
You say, hey, out of curiosity, what's your salary? Or, how much credit card debt are you carrying right now?
Oh, wow. The physical reaction to that is almost instantaneous.
There's a brick wall, the temperature in the room plummets 20 degrees, people suddenly find their napkins completely fascinating. You get this immediate physical whiplash from how fast the tone changes, from warm vulnerability to absolute rigid defensiveness.
It is a profound whiplash. You watch people literally cross their arms over their chests, their eyes dart away. The silence is just deafening.
It really is.
And in that split second, you realize you haven't just asked a math question. You have stepped on a massive, hidden cultural landmine.
It's the ultimate taboo. And that is exactly the mission of our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We're looking at this incredibly rich linguistic and psychological analysis regarding the hidden cost of financial silence. We want to figure out why money remains the absolute final frontier of conversational taboo in American culture.
Right, because we overshare absolutely everything else.
Exactly. Why does this one topic remain completely off limits? And, more importantly, how is this total silence secretly dictating our lives behind the scenes? And what are the concrete steps you can take to actually break free from it?
So to really understand this, we have to start by looking at the baseline of how the human brain processes money.
Okay.
We've talked before about internal cognitive biases, right? The mental hardwiring we all share, things like loss aversion.
Oh, yeah. That's the psychological quirk, where the pain of losing $50 feels significantly more intense than the joy of finding $50 on the sidewalk.
Precisely. Our brains are just hypersensitive to financial loss.
Right, and there's present bias, too. That's the voice in your head that prioritizes the immediate dopamine hit of, buying a new pair of shoes today, completely ignoring the long-term security of putting that money into a retirement account for 20 years down the road.
It's the classic angel and devil on the shoulders.
And the devil offering immediate gratification usually wins.
Usually, yeah. And then you layer on top of those biases what psychologists call our money scripts.
Money scripts.
Yeah, these are the deeply embedded, often entirely unconscious beliefs about wealth, scarcity, and work that we picked up in childhood by watching our parents. We all have this internal machinery.
Right.
But what is so fascinating about the analysis we're diving into today is that it zooms out. It says, okay, we have these internal biases, but look at the external cultural architecture we've built.
The environment around us.
Exactly. We have constructed a society that takes those internal flaws and absolutely supercharges them through silence.
It's like we took a flawed engine and decided the best way to fix it was to just weld the hood shut so no one could ever look at it.
That is exactly what we did.
And the material we are unpacking today gives us some incredibly specific language to describe this. We are going to be leaning into some key terms, words like proxy and reductive.
Very important words.
Yeah, because these aren't just academic buzzwords, they are precise tools. Right now, most of us don't even have the vocabulary to articulate our own financial anxieties.
And naming the invisible force is always the first necessary step to dismantling it. If you can't name the architecture of your anxiety, you're going to remain a prisoner to it.
Okay, so to kick us off, I was trying to visualize this whole culture of silence, and it struck me like this.
Let's hear it.
It's as if we are all driving our own cars down a massive high-speed highway, but every single one of us has a broken fuel gauge.
Oh, man.
Right. We have no idea how much gas is in the tank, but we are all so mortified by the idea of pulling over and asking the car next to us, hey, do you know how to check the gas? That we just grip the steering wheel, stare straight ahead, and pretend everything is totally fine. We just keep driving on fumes until we inevitably stall out on the side of the road.
That is a remarkably accurate and honestly terrifying way to picture it.
It's stressful just thinking about it.
It really is. And the real tragedy of that scenario is what happens next. When you finally stall out, you get out of your car, you look around, and you realize the shoulder of the highway is lined with thousands of other stalled cars.
Right.
They're all occupied by people who were just as terrified and ashamed to ask for directions as you were. You were surrounded by people in the exact same predicament, but the silence kept you all completely isolated.
Which brings us right into the core of the issue. Why does this boundary around money talk exist in the first place?
Right.
If it's causing us all to stall out, Why don't we just roll down the window and talk? What becomes incredibly clear when you dig into the history and sociology of this is that the silence is not an accident.
Not at all.
It wasn't some random, innocent social evolution where we just collectively decided it was bad manners. It was systematically and culturally engineered.
Engineered is the exact right word there. We built this trap for ourselves, and we reinforce its walls every single day.
Yeah.
And the foundational concept here, the reason the trap works so well, is that in our culture, money has ceased to be merely a medium of exchange. It functions as a proxy.
Okay, I want to hover on this proxy concept because this really feels like the root of the entire psychological mess we find ourselves in.
It absolutely is.
Like if I go to a coffee shop and hand the barista a $5 bill for a latte, that is a medium of exchange. I am trading stored value for a good.
Right. Simple transaction.
But you're saying society has mutated that. Society looks at how many $5 bills I have stacked in my checking account and uses that number as a proxy, like a stand-in measure, for my actual human worth.
That is exactly what has happened. We treat financial net worth as a direct proxy for a person's intelligence, their discipline, their moral character, and their overall value to the community.
That's so heavy.
It is. We have taken a massively complex, nuanced reality, a human life, with all its systemic advantages, disadvantages, luck, and tragedy, and we have crushed it down into a highly reductive narrative.
Reductive. We're reducing the high-definition picture of a human being into a single pixelated dot of a bank balance.
Yes, the reductive cultural narrative works like a binary code. The positive side of the binary says if you have a lot of money, society automatically assumes you are brilliant, incredibly hardworking, disciplined, and morally upright.
Like you're just inherently better.
Right. The wealth is viewed as indisputable proof of your inherent virtue. You earned it because you are inherently valuable.
And the dark side of that binary is just devastating.
Completely.
If you lack money, the implicit reductive narrative is the exact inverse. If wealth equals virtue, then poverty or financial struggle must equal a lack of virtue.
Exactly.
Society assumes you must be undisciplined, lazy, foolish, or a failure. It assumes there's something fundamentally broken about your character.
It's a brutal assumption.
So, if money is a proxy for moral character, does that mean our bank accounts have essentially become our modern-day resumes for human worth? Like, how did we let a math equation become a moral judgment?
It's wild, right? But we do it because the human brain is lazy, and it is constantly desperate for shortcuts to evaluate other
Social
people.
characters, right.
Think about it. We are social creatures. We need to know who is reliable, who is a good mate, who is a strong leader. But we can't actually see discipline. You can't put hard work under a microscope.
No, those are totally abstract internal concepts.
Exactly. But what can we see? We can see a luxury SUV.
Yeah.
We can see a ZIP code. We can see a tailored suit. We use the math equation as a shortcut for morality because the math is quantifiable and visible.
That makes sense.
But the psychological toll this proxy dynamic takes on you, the individual navigating this society, is absolutely crushing.
Because it completely changes the stakes of a conversation. If I tell you I'm struggling financially, if I say, hey, I can't make rent this month, or I am drowning in credit card debt, I'm no longer just sharing numbers on a spreadsheet. Because of the proxy, I am basically making a public confession of deep personal inadequacy. The analysis calls this a self-indictment. I am serving as my own prosecutor, accusing myself of being a moral failure in front of my peers.
Exactly. It's a self-indictment. You are voluntarily exposing what the culture has told you is irrefutable evidence of your own fundamental flaws.
Who would want to do that?
Nobody. It takes an enormous amount of psychological bravery to do that, which is why almost no one does. But here is the truly insidious part of the trap. Revealing financial success is equally fraught.
Right. You would think the people winning the game would want to talk about it.
But they don't. Because if you reveal that you are doing incredibly well, if you talk about your massive bonus, your brilliant stock portfolio, it is immediately perceived as boasting.
Oh, like you're showing off.
It's seen as arrogant self-promotion, which invites a completely different but equally painful kind of social punishment. It invites envy, resentment, and alienation from your peer group.
So you literally cannot win. It is a perfectly designed lose-lose scenario. If you speak up about your struggles, you face judgment, pity, and shame. If you speak up about your successes, you face alienation and resentment.
Yep.
So what is the only logical self-protective move for a human being to make? You shut your mouth, you stay entirely silent, You suffer or you celebrate in total isolation.
And that isolation is where the real tangible damage begins. This brings us to the first major consequence of this engineered financial silence, and it's a critical one for you to grasp. Financial isolation actively amplifies bad decision-making.
It creates an echo chamber.
Precisely. Think about how we solve problems in every other area of our lives. If you're having a problem in your relationship, you talk to a friend to get perspective.
Right.
If you have a weird pain in your knee, you go to a doctor. We rely on external feedback to correct our own flawed thinking. But when you do not talk about money with anyone, not your partner, not your family, not your closest friend, not even a professional, you lose access to the single most important corrective mechanism available to the human brain.
External perspective.
Yes. You become a sealed one-person echo chamber.
This connects right back to those internal cognitive biases we mentioned at the start.
Absolutely.
Let's take present bias. Say I am having a terrible week at work. I am stressed, I am exhausted, and I get an email for a massive sale on a luxury watch. My present bias is screaming, buy the watch. It will make you feel powerful and successful right now.
And it feels so compelling in the moment.
It really does. Even though logically I know I have a massive tax bill coming due next month, if I am in an echo chamber, there is absolutely nothing stopping me from clicking purchase.
Because there is no dissenting voice.
Right.
A dissenting voice is crucial for healthy cognition. It's someone who cares about you, who looks at your situation objectively and challenges your prevailing view.
Like a reality check.
Exactly. It's a friend who says, hold on, I know you had a bad week, but does a $3,000 watch actually solve your stress, or does it just add debt to your plate? Without that dissenting voice, your present bias goes completely unchecked. Your loss aversion is reinforced. Those childhood money scripts run the entire show, and you convince yourself that terrible financial decisions are actually totally rational.
And we have data on how widespread this behavior is, and honestly, the numbers gave me pause.
They're pretty shocking.
The research highlights that over 40% of Americans who are currently in romantic relationships admit to committing financial infidelity.
40%?
We are talking about actively hiding purchases from a spouse, concealing thousands of dollars in debt, or even maintaining entirely secret bank accounts. 40%.
It is a staggering statistic, and it's important to understand that financial infidelity isn't just a catchy clickbait buzzword.
Right. It sounds almost like a joke, but it's not.
No, it represents a massive systemic breakdown in trust within our most intimate relationships. It is a cancer in a marriage. It destroys long-term partnerships. It dissolves trust that took decades to build, and it fractures families permanently. And it is the direct, predictable result of a culture where talking about money feels existentially threatening.
Okay, I have to push back on this survey data for a second.
Sure.
If 40% of people openly admitted to financial infidelity on a survey, what is the real number? Because realistically, if our entire culture is built on this massive shame infrastructure and we treat money as a moral proxy, wouldn't people lie on the survey too, even if it's anonymous?
It is highly probable that they do. Sociologists and pollsters refer to this as social desirability bias.
Social desirability bias.
Right. Even when a survey is completely anonymous, human beings instinctively hesitate to admit to behaviors that they themselves consider deeply shameful or unethical. We want to view ourselves as good people.
Of course we do.
So that 40% figure, that is likely the absolute floor. The real number is almost certainly much higher.
That is deeply unsettling.
It is. And if you think about the actual day-to-day mechanics of this infidelity, it paints a very sad picture. Imagine a spouse who is feeling overwhelmed and inadequate. They buy something expensive online that they know they can't afford. Maybe it's designer clothes, maybe it's expensive car parts, just chasing that proxy of success.
Right, trying to look apart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The moment the purchase is complete, the dopamine fades and the shame sets in. So what do? They track the shipping meticulously so they can intercept the package on the front porch before their partner gets home from work.
Wow.
They rip up the receipt, they bury the credit card statement in the trash, or switch it to paperless so it's hidden in an inbox. They are functioning entirely inside that dark one-person echo chamber, terrified of the self-indictment that would come with looking their partner in the eye and admitting they lost control.
It's just so tragic. It's not a cute, victimless crime like sneaking a piece of chocolate on a diet.
No, not at all.
It's two people who supposedly love each other, sleeping in the exact same bed every night, but they are completely walled off from each other by a fortress of math and shame.
That's a great way to put it.
But as the analysis points out, the damage of this silence isn't contained to adults hiding Amazon boxes from each other. This culture of silence is fundamentally failing the next generation before they even have a chance to start their adult lives.
This is perhaps the most structurally damaging consequence of all. The generational trap of financial illiteracy. The silence we maintain as adults perpetuates an absolutely staggering lack of financial education for our children.
The numbers on this are wild.
Yeah.
The research points out that only about a third of U.S. states require a standalone personal finance course for high school graduation.
A third.
Let that sink in. 1/3. That means a vast majority of kids in this country are walking across a graduation stage, receiving a diploma, and entering the adult world with zero formal academic instruction on how to manage the single resource that will dictate the security, stress, and trajectory of the rest of their lives.
It is a complete systemic failure. So we have an education system that largely refuses to teach it. And then, because of the proxy problem and the shame infrastructure we just discussed, we have a family culture that absolutely refuses to discuss it at home.
Because the parents are embarrassed.
Exactly. Parents are terrified of their children finding out about their own financial missteps, their own lack of retirement savings, or their own credit card debt. So they keep quiet under the guise of protecting the kids.
But it's not protecting them at all.
Not even a little. The result is millions of young adults left completely unmoored, thrown into a highly predatory financial ocean without a life vest.
The scenario they lay out to illustrate this is so devastatingly common. Picture an 18-year-old kid. They've been told their whole life that going to a 4-year college is the only path to respectability.
Right, the only way to succeed.
So they sit in a fluorescent-lit financial aid office and sign their name on documents that commit them to $80,000 in student loan debt. They are taking on a mortgage-sized burden for a degree that might have incredibly unclear employment prospects.
And they are signing those papers without any conceptual understanding of how compound interest actually works.
None.
They don't understand the difference between subsidized and unsubsidized loans. They don't grasp amortization schedules, and they certainly haven't been taught how to calculate the actual return on investment of the specific degree they are purchasing.
And society often turns around 10 years later and blames them for it. We call them entitled or financially irresponsible when they're struggling to pay it back at age 28.
Which is so unfair.
It really is. But we have to look at the system they are operating within when they sign that paper. The research introduces a critical concept here that explains why it's so hard for them: strategic ambiguity.
Strategic ambiguity.
I honestly love this term. I mean, I hate what it does to people, but I love the precision of the phrase. What does strategic ambiguity actually look like in the real world?
Strategic ambiguity is a deliberate tactic. It occurs when massive financial institutions, like credit card companies, mortgage lenders, or student loan servicers, intentionally deploy overly complex, vague, or highly technical language to obscure the reality of a financial agreement.
Okay.
They are deliberately making the terms difficult to parse.
Right, because we tend to think those 47-page terms of service agreements are just a necessary evil of the legal system. Like, oh, the lawyers made them do.
They aren't writing 47 pages of dense legalese simply because a judge somewhere demanded it. They're writing them because confusion directly serves their profit margins.
Wow.
If an 18-year-old, or a 40-year-old for that matter, does not understand how the interest on their credit card compounds daily rather than annually, or how a missed payment triggers a penalty APR of 29%, they are vastly more likely to carry a balance and incur fees.
Because they just don't get it.
Exactly. The ambiguity is strategic because it is profitable.
It makes me think of an analogy.
Yeah.
Expecting an 18-year-old to successfully navigate these strategically ambiguous loan documents is like expecting a random teenager to fly a commercial Boeing 747 because they once watched a 10-minute YouTube video on basic aerodynamics.
That is perfectly stated.
And to make it worse, the entire dashboard of the plane has been intentionally rewritten in a foreign language they don't speak. It's not just difficult, it is setting them up for an inevitable crash.
That analogy hits the nail on the head. The financial dashboard is specifically designed to be unreadable to the layman.
Yeah.
And because money is such a taboo subject, that 18-year-old doesn't feel comfortable going to an uncle or a neighbor or a teacher and saying, hey, can you help me translate this?
Yeah.
They don't want to look stupid, so they just sign it, hoping for the best.
So if we look at the wreckage so far, we have the individual psychological toll of the proxy trap, we have the relational destruction of financial infidelity in the echo chamber, and we have the generational failure of education. It's a lot.
It is. But the analysis takes it a step further, and this is where it gets incredibly profound. This strategic ambiguity and this generational silence don't impact everyone equally. They aren't just personal problems. They are actually the invisible, load-bearing walls of societal disparity.
Exactly. This brings us to consequence number 3, the invisible architecture of inequality. The core argument here is that when no one talks about money, massive structural disparities are allowed to remain completely hidden, and therefore they remain unchallenged.
Let's unpack that carefully. And I want to pause here for a second, just tell you, the listener, we are impartially reporting the source material's sociological assertions about structural disparities and wage gaps here.
Right.
We aren't endorsing a specific political platform or viewpoint. We're just neutrally explaining the source's argument on how information asymmetry functions in a society.
Exactly. The sociological data approaches things like the gender pay gap or racial wealth gaps, not just as moral failings of society, but fundamentally as information problems. It's an asymmetry of information.
Okay, that makes sense. The research argues that silence serves as an active mechanism that preserves inequality. Let's take the gender pay gap as an example.
Sure.
Why does it persist, even in industries that claim to be progressive? It persists largely because of salary secrecy.
Right.
If a woman does not know that the man sitting in the cubicle next to her, doing the exact same job with the exact same experience, is making 20% more than she is, she cannot advocate for herself.
Because she doesn't know.
Exactly. The silence prevents her from seeing the disparity. If no one talks about their salary, the inequality remains invisible to the very people being disadvantaged by it.
Yeah.
And if you can't see a problem, you certainly cannot correct it.
To illustrate how this works across generations, the research uses this really compelling, contrasting scenario of 2 hypothetical families. Let's walk through it.
Let's do it.
Imagine the first family. They're wealthy, well-connected. They sit around their mahogany dining table, and while they might not shout about their wealth to the neighborhood, internally they are highly communicative.
Right. Closed doors, but open conversation.
Exactly. The parents quietly, but very specifically, teach their children about the mechanics of wealth. They talk about capital gains taxes over roast beef. They discuss the importance of asset protection, real estate leverage, and estate planning. They are transferring not just financial capital, but a vast, sophisticated network of financial literacy.
Now, contrast that with the second family. They are working class, perhaps struggling just to make ends meet.
Okay.
They sit at their dinner table in tense silence. They never discuss money because of the intense shame and the self-indictment we talked about earlier.
No proxy trap.
Yes. The parents feel like failures because they are living paycheck to paycheck, so they shield their kids from the reality of the bills. The kids pick up on the anxiety but learn none of the mechanics.
And the crucial point the analysis makes is that these advantages and disadvantages don't just remain static, they compound.
They do.
The wealthy family's advantage, their literacy, their strategies, grows exponentially over generations. The silent family's disadvantage deepens. Financial silence ensures that this vital knowledge transfer happens exclusively in closed, privileged networks, systematically excluding marginalized communities from ever learning the rules of the game.
What's so terrifying about this is how completely normal it looks from the outside. The research describes this dynamic as incredibly insidious. It disguises systemic, generational harm as mere personal preference or just politeness.
Right, like, oh, we just don't talk about those things in polite company. It sounds so refined.
Which is the perfect cover.
Yeah.
It feels like simple etiquette. You think you are just being a well-mannered person by not bringing up money. But that etiquette functions perfectly as a gatekeeping mechanism.
Oh, wait, let me push back on this a bit. I understand the outcome is unequal. But doesn't some of this silence stem from a genuine, innocent desire to just not be awkward at a dinner party? I mean, are we saying this politeness was intentional, weaponized by the elite to keep people down? Or is it just a convenient, accidental side effect for the people at the top?
It's a great question. The sociological view doesn't necessarily argue that there is a smoke-filled room of elites twisting their mustaches, intentionally weaponizing etiquette to crush the working class.
Okay, good. That would be a little conspiratorial.
Right. Rather, it argues that social systems naturally evolve to protect the status quo. Regardless of whether the historical origins of the politeness rule were innocent, the function of the rule today is that it fiercely protects those who already hold the cards. When you benefit immensely from a system being opaque and secretive, you have zero incentive to challenge the etiquette of silence. It's a highly convenient side effect that solidifies your advantageous position without you having to actively, consciously oppress anyone. The silence does the work for you.
Okay, so if this silence is so deeply damaging to us individually, creating these toxic echo chambers and driving financial infidelity, and if it's so damaging societally, preserving compounding inequality, why on earth haven't we smashed this taboo by now?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because we live in an era of radical, almost aggressive transparency. People will turn on their front-facing camera and post a TikTok crying about their deepest childhood traumas, their medical diagnoses, their bad dates, but they will absolutely not post their credit score. Why does this one wall still stand?
This is the great paradox of our time. And the research points to two massive interlocking psychological roadblocks that keep this wall standing: the shame infrastructure and the social media treadmill.
Okay, let's look at the shame infrastructure first.
Sure. As we mentioned, in American culture, debt is not viewed as a mathematical reality. It is widely viewed as a moral failing. Therefore, asking for financial help isn't just a logistical request for a loan or advice. It is an act that is deeply, profoundly humiliating.
It strips away your dignity.
Yes. And when you ask for help or admit you are drowning financially, it costs you relational capital.
Relational capital.
Think of relational capital as the trust, the social standing, the respect, and the goodwill you have painstakingly built with your peers over years.
Like your reputation.
Exactly. If you admit to your friend group that you completely mismanaged your money and are facing bankruptcy, you risk them viewing you differently. You risk losing your standing as the responsible one. You risk being alienated. The cost of admission for honesty is your social standing.
So the stakes of telling the truth are incredibly high. But then you add the second roadblock, social media, to the mix, and it's like pouring high-octane gasoline on a fire.
It really is.
The analysis talks extensively about comparison anxiety, which social media has severely exacerbated. It has taken a natural human tendency to compare ourselves to others and magnified it 1,000,000 times over.
Precisely. Social media has exacerbated this anxiety by exploiting a profound psychological error we all make. It completely collapses the distinction between wealth and spending.
Let's hover on that for a second, because that is a massive blind spot for most of us. We collapse wealth and spending in our minds. We treat them as the exact same thing.
We do. Our brains naturally assume that visible consumption equals prosperity. If we see someone posting a photo from a first-class flight to Dubai, or showing off a massive marble-covered kitchen renovation, or driving a brand-new luxury SUV, our brain instantly registers, oh, that person is wealthy.
Right.
But in reality, spending money is the exact opposite of having money. The act of buying the SUV literally means you have less wealth than you did yesterday.
Right. The guy in the first-class seat might be up to his eyeballs in high-interest credit card debt, sweating through his expensive shirt about how he's going to pay for the hotel.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, the woman driving a 10-year-old beat-up sedan might have a 7-figure investment portfolio quietly compounding in the background. You genuinely cannot tell just by looking.
But social media strips away the context. You only see the consumption, never the balance sheet.
Social media is like a financial funhouse mirror.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, we scroll through and see the glowing, perfectly filtered luxury vacation on the beach, but the mirror strategically crops out the crushing, maxed-out credit card statements sitting on their kitchen counter back home. We are comparing our behind-the-scenes reality to their heavily edited highlight reel of consumption.
And because your brain processes those images of luxury as hard, objective data, it creates a psychological phenomenon called relative deprivation.
Relative deprivation.
This is the feeling that you are severely disadvantaged and failing, not because your objective actual circumstances are poor. I mean, you might have a perfectly fine house, a reliable car, and enough to eat, but because your perceived position relative to others feels entirely inadequate.
And the others we're comparing ourselves to aren't even our actual neighbors anymore. 50 years ago, you compared your lawn to the guy next door.
Right.
If you got a new mower, you felt a little twinge of jealousy. Now, your reference group isn't the guy next door. It's an algorithmically curated global highlight reel of millions of strangers who are actively, professionally trying to look richer than they actually are.
Which places you directly on the hedonic treadmill.
The hedonic treadmill.
Yes. A treadmill, in this metaphorical sense, means you're expending enormous amounts of energy, you're working longer hours, earning more money, buying better things, but making absolutely no forward progress in your baseline level of satisfaction.
You're just running in place.
You're running as fast as you can just to stay in the same emotional place. The benchmark for what constitutes doing well keeps automatically adjusting upward every single time you open the app.
It's a trap. You save up, you finally get the kitchen renovation, you post the picture, you get the dopamine hit from the likes, and the very next day, the algorithm shows you an influencer who just bought a second vacation home in Aspen. The satisfaction completely vanishes overnight. You are sweating on the treadmill, you are exhausted, but you haven't moved an inch toward actual happiness.
It's incredibly exhausting. And this funhouse mirror, this exhausting treadmill, is propped up and justified by perhaps the most deeply ingrained, almost religious cultural narrative in American society, the mythology of meritocracy.
Ugh.
Okay, the mythology of meritocracy. This is heavy.
Yeah.
And as a quick framing note for you listening, the psychological and sociological evaluation of the meritocracy narrative we are about to discuss is a core piece of the research.
Right.
We're objectively presenting the source's psychological evaluation here. We are not taking a stance on capitalism or political ideology. We're merely relaying the text's assertion that structural realities exist alongside individual effort.
Exactly. So what is this mythology of meritocracy? In its purest form, it is the deeply held, almost sacred belief that financial outcomes are determined purely, 100%, by individual effort, inherent talent, and moral discipline.
Okay.
The myth says, if you work hard, you will succeed, period. And the dark corollary is, if you do not succeed, you simply did not work hard enough. And the research points out that this narrative is so incredibly powerful and resilient because it is highly plausible. It seems completely reasonable on the surface. And frankly, it contains a significant degree of truth. Hard work does matter. Personal discipline is absolutely essential for building a life. Nobody is denying the value of effort.
Right. It is plausible. Effort matters immensely. But the psychological analysis argues that this myth becomes toxic when it insists on an overly reductive absolutist narrative. It intentionally conceals massive, uncontrollable systemic realities.
Like what?
Well, the absolute meritocracy myth ignores the fact that where you're born geographically, skyrocketing healthcare costs, access to generational wealth, and pure, unadulterated chance play massive roles in a person's ultimate financial outcome.
Oh, absolutely.
You can have two people who work exactly as hard with the exact same discipline and intelligence, and they can end up in completely different financial universes simply because one had a devastating medical emergency at age 25 and the other didn't.
So let's look at the psychological trap this absolute belief creates. If you buy into the meritocracy myth entirely, if you believe that your financial outcome is 100% earned by your own two hands and your own moral virtue, then admitting that you are struggling financially is functionally admitting that you are a total personal failure. You are admitting you are lazy or incompetent or unworthy.
Which is a psychologically devastating realization. No one wants to view themselves as unworthy.
Right.
So what do people do when they face financial struggle in a meritocracy? They fake it. They finance the appearance of success with high-interest debt to avoid the crushing shame of looking like a failure to their peers. This creates a deeply self-perpetuating cycle.
A self-perpetuating cycle. It feeds on itself.
Exactly. Let's walk through it. I feel inadequate because I'm struggling, so I take on debt to buy a nice car so I look successful. My neighbor sees my car, suddenly feels inadequate by comparison, and takes on debt to renovate his kitchen to keep up. I see his new kitchen, feel inadequate again, and book a luxury vacation on credit. The cycle continues indefinitely. Everyone is aggressively faking success, and as a result, everyone feels completely alone in their silent, internal terror about how they are actually going to pay the bills at the end of the month.
Okay, I have to push back on this a little bit, just philosophically.
Go for it.
I hear what the sociology is saying about structural barriers and luck. But if we completely dismantle this belief that hard work guarantees success, don't we risk people just throwing their hands up in despair?
How do you mean?
Like, hey, if the system is rigged by geography and medical luck, why should I even try to budget? Why should I even try to save money? How does the framework suggest we balance the very real, practical need for personal discipline with the acknowledgement of these invisible structural barriers?
That is the exact delicate tension the research highlights. The goal of recognizing structural barriers isn't to abandon personal discipline, it's to abandon the toxic shame associated with those barriers.
Oh, that makes sense.
Acknowledging that the game has unequal starting lines, or that unexpected hurdles exist, doesn't mean you sit down on the track and stop running. It means you stop hating yourself if you aren't in first place.
Right.
It allows you to view your own financial struggles with self-compassion rather than self-indictment. When you remove the shame, you actually free up mental energy to make better, more rational financial choices moving forward.
That makes a ton of sense. It's about removing the heavy blanket of moral judgment from what is essentially just a math equation.
Exactly.
So we've mapped the terrain. We understand the psychological traps, the proxy problem, the echo chamber, the strategic ambiguity, the funhouse mirror of the comparison treadmill, and the meritocracy trap. The big question is, what are the actual interventions? How do we break this cycle of silence?
The research outlines 4 concrete pillars of change. 4 highly actionable interventions to dismantle the silence in your own life. The first pillar is normalizing financial imperfection.
Normalizing it. We need to make it completely unremarkable to talk about making a mistake. We need to strip the drama out of it.
Exactly. Right now, admitting you don't understand how your taxes work, or admitting you carry credit card debt from a bad year, feels like a dramatic, tearful confession.
It really does.
The first step is to actively create conversational spaces where saying, "Man, I made a terrible financial mistake last year," elicits a casual shrug and a, "Yeah, me too,"
Right.
rather than a gasp of horror. Think about it. Everyone listening to this has made a financial mistake. Everyone.
Absolutely.
Pretending otherwise just fuels the shame cycle.
I try to imagine what this looks like in practice. You're at a bar with a friend, and they suggest ordering another round of expensive drinks. And instead of making up an excuse about being tired, you just casually say, "I'd love to, but I'm actually trying to aggressively pay down a credit card I maxed out last summer, so I'm sticking to water."
Yes.
Just saying it like it's a fact about the weather.
Yes, you state it neutrally.
Yeah.
And what you'll find is that 9 times out of 10, the other person's shoulders will drop in relief. And they'll say, "Oh, thank God, I'm broke right now too." You give them permission to drop the facade.
That's incredibly powerful. So pillar 1 is normalizing financial imperfection. What is the second pillar?
Pillar 2 is continuous education. We have to fundamentally shift how we view learning about money. We have to move away from treating financial education as a one-time high school inoculation.
I love that framing. An inoculation. Like, you get a single personal finance vaccine shot in 11th grade, and society assumes you are permanently immune to financial ruin for the rest of your life.
It's a completely flawed model. The research argues that financial education must be commensurate with the evolving complexity of adult life.
Makes sense.
The financial decisions you make at age 18, maybe managing a part-time job paycheck, are vastly different from the highly complex decisions you make at 35 when you're trying to secure a mortgage and navigate childcare costs.
Oh, totally.
Which are entirely different from the decisions you make at 55 when you are strategizing tax-efficient retirement withdrawals and estate planning. The education needs to continually scale up to match the complexity of the life stage.
Treating financial education like a one-time inoculation in high school is like thinking that participating in a single dodgeball class at age 15 is going to keep your cardiovascular system in perfect condition for the next 50 years.
Exactly.
It's absurd. Your body changes, the demands change. You have to keep working out. You have to keep proactively seeking out new knowledge as your financial life gets more complicated.
It is a lifelong practice, not a checkbox. Which brings us to pillar 3, which shifts the focus from the individual to the workplace, transparent compensation.
Okay.
The research argues that to break the silence, we must battle what it calls enforced ignorance within our institutions.
Enforced ignorance, meaning the system isn't just accidentally confusing, it is actively structurally designed to prevent you from knowing the data you need to advocate for yourself, like what your peers in the exact same role are earning.
Yes, and the research notes that whenever pay transparency laws are proposed, they face vehement, incredibly well-funded resistance from corporate entities.
Because that clarity directly threatens their systemic advantage. When the employer is the only one who holds all the salary data in the building, they hold 100% of the negotiating power.
Exactly.
They can underpay people for years simply because the employees are too polite or too legally constrained to talk to each other. Transparency completely shifts that power balance, which is why the resistance from the top is so intense.
Spot on.
Okay, so we have normalizing imperfection in casual conversation, continuous lifelong education, and advocating for transparent compensation in the workplace. What is the fourth and final pillar?
The fourth pillar is the ultimate personal tool, and ironically, it is perhaps the most difficult one to execute, having financially honest relationships.
Honest relationships.
And specifically, the research focuses on the transformative power of having just one relationship based on reciprocal vulnerability.
Reciprocal vulnerability, it has to be a two-way street.
Yes. It is mutual. To be clear, this is not about going on Twitter and broadcasting your salary to thousands of strangers. It is not about trauma dumping your credit card debt onto an acquaintance who just sits there in uncomfortable silence and judges you.
Right.
It is about intentionally finding one person, a romantic partner, a trusted sibling, a deeply loyal friend, where you both explicitly agree to lay down the cultural armor.
Yeah.
You agree to show them your real, unvarnished numbers, and they agree to show you theirs.
And the incredible power of that mutual vulnerability is that it instantly shatters the one-person echo chamber we talked about in the beginning.
It does.
When you have that one trusted person, you finally get that dissenting voice. You get someone who knows your goals, who cares about your well-being enough to pull you aside and say, hey, I see you are about to put a $3,000 luxury vacation on a credit card with a 22% interest rate.
Right.
Is this purchase what you actually need to recharge? Or is this really about how terrible you felt after your boss yelled at you today?
That is an incredibly powerful, life-altering question. And it's a question that almost no one ever hears because they refuse to let anyone close enough to see the numbers to ask it.
Wow.
Having just one financially honest relationship provides perspective, it provides vital accountability, and most importantly, it proves to your subconscious that you are still worthy of love and respect even when your finances are a complete mess. It actively, practically destroys the proxy myth that your worth is tied to your bank account.
It uncouples the math from the morality. So to really synthesize everything we've deeply explored today, if you feel overwhelmed by money, realize that your financial life is essentially a high-speed collision between two massive forces.
Yes.
On one side, you have your internal psychological machinery, your inherent biases, your loss aversion, your present bias. On the other side, you have the external cultural architecture, the shame infrastructure, the proxy trap, the strategic ambiguity of institutions, and the exhausting funhouse mirror of social media.
But the single most empowering takeaway from all of this research is that you are not merely a passive victim of this collision.
Right.
You have the deliberate power to examine these forces. Once you can see the invisible architecture, once you name the proxy, once you recognize the echo chamber, it fundamentally loses its power over you.
Which means improving your financial reality doesn't actually start with downloading some shiny new budgeting app or making a hollow New Year's resolution to buy fewer lattes.
No, it doesn't.
It starts with radical internal honesty. It starts with sitting down and genuinely looking at what money means to you, what proxy you are using it for, whose approval you are trying to buy, not just what it physically purchases.
It requires acknowledging the silence that surrounds you, recognizing how it harms you, and then actively choosing not to participate in it anymore.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your week. We live in a world where everyone is desperately trying to make a statement. Everyone wants to be a disruptor. But what if the most rebellious, countercultural action you could possibly take this week isn't arguing politics online or buying into some flashy new crypto trend? What if the absolute most rebellious thing you could do is simply sit down with a trusted friend, look them squarely in the eye, and tell them, honestly and without an ounce of shame, exactly how much debt you carry?
It would completely shatter the whiplash.
Imagine being back at that Thanksgiving dinner, someone awkwardly asks about your credit card debt, and instead of the temperature plummeting, instead of the rigid silence, you just answer the question. You tell the truth. You normalize the imperfection. And maybe, just maybe, the person sitting across the table lets out a massive sigh of relief, drops her own armor, and says, "Thank God, me too."